Energy media readers, today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite analysts of the energy transition, Kingsmill Bond, who works with Carbon Tracker out of London, UK. Welcome to the interview, Kingsmill.
Thanks, Markham. Good to be here.
Now, you wrote an op-ed for the Energy Transition magazine, which is published by the Rocky Mountain Institute. It was very, very interesting. It's about the energy transition, COVID-19, and the pace of the transition. Why don't we start with, give us an overview of your argument.
So we just made one primary argument, which is that as in any transition, when structural change meets cyclical change, then the moment of the cycle can bring forward a structural peak. So if, to put flesh on that argument, if people had anticipated a peak in demand for conventional vehicles, let's say in the mid-2020s, and then you get a kind of cyclical downturn, by the time the growth comes back for the car industry, actually electric vehicles are so big that they're taking all of the growth. So that means that a peak in demand for conventional cars happens several years earlier than people had anticipated. And now we're seeing something arguably similar in the fossil fuel sector as a whole, that a structural change which was going to lead to peaking demand in the 2020s, that peak may well have been brought forward. And I think we've already seen, for example, peak demand for fossil fuels in electricity generation.
Right, and I want to throw something out to you because I actually, in the mid-'80s, when I was doing my master's thesis, which was on the transition from horse-drawn technology to power farming technology in Saskatchewan, which is next door to Alberta. And one of the things that, the trends I noticed was that there was of course we had the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, and then there was an economic downturn in 1920 and 1921. And when the economy recovered in 1922 and onwards, the sale of tractors and then eventually combines for threshing the grain really picked up. It noticeably accelerated, and it almost sounds like that trend is just what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. A lot of people are comparing the coronavirus to a war, and war is well known to speed up change. So I think it's highly likely that when we eventually come out of this crisis, that governments, particularly energy importing governments, as they seek to set the new direction of their economies, they will plan for a green system rather than going back to a brown system, and it makes sense for them to do so. And I think we need to draw a distinction between the kind of panic and the chaos that we're facing right now, and we're likely to face for the next few weeks or months, and the kind of strategic planning which will follow once we get normalization.
Now, this is interesting because I was corresponding with an oil and gas executive just this morning, and he was making the argument that, in fact, the scenario you described will lead to a return to the status quo and a slowing of the transition, because consumers in Canada will want to go back to security, they will want jobs and incomes and all of those things, and they want to go back to what they know, not to some future that they aren't familiar with, and so it works in the industry's favor. How would you respond to that argument?
I think we may have had this discussion before, that the world is not Canada, and it is not really what the consumers of Canada may or may not want. It's more what the consumers in the world's giant emerging markets, what they want and how they're going to set the direction of their economies. And as I see it, the great risk for a fossil fuel producer like Canada would be to double down on the past. And it's a little bit like bailing out Blockbuster in 2008, or bailing out, going back to your dissertation, the horse industry in 1918. I mean, these are industries which have, even by the most optimistic analysis, of basically the end of their lives. I mean, even before the crisis, the global fossil fuel industry was growing at 1% a year. And if you think it's taken this crisis to drop that to negative, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. We often talk about in the energy sector how Alberta is not the center of the universe, despite the fact that it thinks it is. Well, let's talk about another idea that you had in your op-ed, and that is the tax wedge policy. So could you explain that, please?
So as things currently stand globally, the fossil fuel industry gets about $400 billion in subsidies, and there are about $400 billion in taxes. So actually, on a net basis, it's basically not taxed. And what can now happen, particularly amongst the energy importers, is that as the cost of fossil fuels has fallen very, very rapidly, they can take off these subsidies. And in addition to that, they can start to tax these the fossil fuel industries for the externalities that they're generating, which everyone now accepts are for real. But the policymakers couldn't really tax them because they felt that the status quo was just too difficult to disturb. That's the other thing that crisis does. It removes the necessity just to follow the status quo.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we could see Europe, for instance, is already moving towards carbon pricing. Wasn't there some talk in the EU about a carbon really ramping up the carbon pricing in the wake of COVID-19?
So there's certainly a lot of talk about carbon pricing at the moment. I think what we should probably again distinguish is between what happens in the next 6 weeks, where there's just lots of ideas and lots of fear and lots of panic, and what slightly more sober-minded policymakers may well do once, as I say, the situation normalizes. And I think it's very hard to miss the point that the rise of taxation is a global for fossil fuels, a global phenomenon. It's only been going on really, the increase, for about the last 2 years, but there's a long way to go. And in most countries, except with the exception of fossil fuel producing countries, that is to say 80% of the world, there's a very, very clear trend to higher and higher taxes on and the removal of subsidies.
A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a Canadian energy regulator economist who had done a levelized cost of driving, which basically he figured out the cost for small cars and a pickup truck of price per kilometer for an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine vehicle. And the EV was marginally cheaper on than its ICE equivalent, and the EV truck was marginally more costly than. But the point here is that was with the 2018 technology, and now we're seeing like GM unveil its Ultium platform and so on. And if I were a policymaker looking at this, and I would say, well, now if EVs are going to be significantly cheaper, we have a disruption. Maybe now is the time to really put in place some policies that accelerate the electrification of transportation.
That, I think, is precisely what the more sober-minded policymakers will start to do as the situation normalizes and they're thinking about how to build out their new economies. Don't forget that people will be searching for ways to stimulate their economies. They don't want to make the same mistake as they made in 2008, where China poured hundreds of billions of dollars into more coal-fired power generation, and very coal-intensive industries are going to be looking for other ways, cleaner ways to stimulate their economies. And it's not, don't forget, it's not just the question of cost. There's also energy security is involved here, and we have more and more global stresses, which the virus is increasing. There's also the question of pollution. So there are other pressures upon policymakers in Asia in particular to seek to build out their economies in new ways.
Well, final question, Kingsmill, and this is a theme that I come back to over and over again in my columns and in my reporting, and that is the myopia that exists in Canada, but particularly in Alberta, which really literally does think it's the center of the universe. And I want you, if you could comment on what's going on at the global level. You're in London, you're talking to people all over the world, who are policymakers and leading thinkers about this. Give us a sense of what they're saying about the energy transition and how quickly it's likely to speed up.
So I think there's an increasing amount of talk now about how to plan for the next stage. There's an increasing amount of talk about the peak in demand. There's a lot of talk about the observation that a relatively small reduction in demand has led to a very spectacular reduction in price. And I think there's an increasing acceptance that there are actually large parts of the fossil fuel industry which are increasingly stranded. And I think I would just make this really simple observation that a lot of these jobs at the top end of the cost curve are never coming back. And it's actually a senseless use of public resources. What people and policymakers should now be doing is retraining the workers and finding them new roles in the new economy, not trying to prop up a dying system.
Gotcha. Kingsmill, thank you very much. Always appreciate this, and we'll look forward to our next conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Markham. I hope you survive this crisis one way or the other.
And the same to you, sir.
Thank you.